capability. It's called VTOL. And where did that come from? It didn't come from the Navy. It didn't come from the Air Force. It came from the Marines.
Is it VTOL or SVTOL? Because from footage I've seen, they don't take off vertically. They have a short runway. Then they kind of use that lift assist to get off a very short runway. But
they can take off vertically.
Okay.
They can take off. I mean, I can't remember. I mean, it's been 6 years. I don't know if it's SVTOL or whatever.
I think, okay, so what I'm confusing is they have an S and then they have a slash. And so I think that what it means is that they can take off short, which is probably safer. But if push comes to shove, they can do VTOL as well. So I think that's what the slash designates.
When you're on an LVN type of carrier, which is the Marines, it's basically like a short, stubby, aircraft carrier. I mean, they have to use VTOL.
Yeah, the WASP was the sort of designated.
Yes, I was on the WASP.
Okay.
Yes, I was on the WASP. But what's crazy about this program was that the Marine Corps drove a lot of the requirements of this. And the Marine
Corps, ones that got the stupid helmet basically requirements because the dumb engine is right behind the cockpit, so you can't see behind. That's what I heard, at least. That's one of the reasons the helmet is so complicated, because you have to, when you look behind you, the stupid helmet takes over and gives you the virtual footage of what is behind the aircraft.
Yes, I mean the Marine Corps variant, the Aviate, or I keep saying the Aviate B, the F-35B. It's got that big lift fan behind it. So yes, your visibility is really terrible. But what is really crazy about this program was the Marine Corps is getting 500 of these aircraft. The Navy is getting, I think, I don't know, more than that, twice as much, about 1,100. And, the rest of it goes to the aircraft or the Air Force.
So they only get 700 vehicles or whatever it is? The Air Force?
They're getting I think they're getting 2,700 vehicles was the plan. I mean, it's coming down every day, with the cost.
Are you talking about the Pentagon, or are you talking about the Air Force now? The total or the Air Force?
In total for the U.S. government, it's over 2,700 aircraft.
Yeah, okay.
But the smallest buyer of it is the Marine Corps, and they are the big driver,
right,
of basically the total shape of that aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
That aircraft would look a whole lot more like the F-22 if it was just an aircraft or an Air Force.
Well, you mentioned the lift fan, and I just want to add in to what you previously said about how it takes off vertically. The two main thrust vectors are from the aft engine nozzle, where the forward thrust comes from. That's the typical design for a jet, is it pushes out from the back and it pushes you forward. But in addition to that, the F-35B has this lift fan, which is right behind the pilot, and that is actually driven purely mechanically by a drive shaft that comes from the turbine itself, and then it just has a gear that rotates at 90 degrees, and then it just blows air down. It has to come from an upper intake, obviously, but the control nozzles are basically just for the pilot to kind of make sure it doesn't flip over or something, but they don't really lift it up. But it's those two main thrust vectors that push it off the ground, and it's pretty innovative design, but it just, as you said, it just made it so bulky, the aircraft, because you had to add that big fan, that second fan. It's almost like a second turbine. It's not technically a turbine, but it's basically a giant fan that looks like a mini turbine, that is just driven mechanically, that takes up all that space, and that's why it's so kind of bulbous looking, and you can't see behind you.
Yes, and it also has to have a transmission-like device, because if you're taking direct mechanical force off of the first stage of the engine, and you have to transfer it vertically, I mean, there's got to be some type of a transmission type system that decelerates that fan, if you will. So I mean, that's been a huge problem too. So basically, the one thing what I find interesting about this program is it was really the Marine Corps that really drove these requirements, and it boggles my mind that
they have a lot of political influence, vastly discommensurate with their kind of paper budget or force size.
Right. Yeah. And I think you're also talking about the helmet. I think they, from what I remember, they basically took up another helmet that was less technically complicated. You know,
Well,
the original.
Go ahead.
What the original one they had was just way too complicated. And I've put that helmet on my head before. And yeah, I mean, it didn't work even when I put it on, you know. So, and one thing I would also say, like, I really want to talk about, I was mostly focused on the Marine Corps and the Italian military that were basically the big, buyers of the F-35B. One thing I don't get is, the Marine Corps prides itself on basically austere type of logistics. They claim that they're, the first one's in, the last one's out or whatever. That's all bullshit. But, with the Marine Corps, with the AV-8B, it was a fairly austere aircraft. It was completely, it was a very difficult plane to fly. I've talked to a lot of AV-8B pilots before.
The Harrier.
It was the Harrier was very difficult to fly. With the F-35, I spent probably 3 months at the first Marine Corps base that fielded the F-35. And the aircraft, we can get into this topic more later on in the podcast, but the aircraft, right as they left Fort Worth, they had to go completely into a depot type of position. And when I say a depot, I mean, you're talking about, it's not first line flight chiefs that maintain it. They had to go into a situation where they had to completely retrofit the lift fan right behind it. So they were flying off out of Fort Worth. They would land at Yuma, and we had a depot team right there that had to completely retrofit that plane. And
talking about every production unit or just the first one?
Yes, every production unit.
So why is Lockheed, I guess you're the final assembler, but Pratt & Whitney designed the engines, if I'm not mistaken, so why are you responsible for fixing every engine after it's put in?
It wasn't the engine. It was the gates that basically controlled that lift fan. If you're going to do like a vertical takeoff and landing, you have to have these big gates on the top of the plane that opened up.
Yeah. And
the first version of it had like a big old gate that came up the front of it and went towards the back. And then it came up with, some other like folding type of a design. But, the thing that I always, told the Marines that I was working with is just like, how is this plane sustainable? Because we had to have like these little, when you're talking about a stealth plane, you're talking about making sure that there's no gaps at all. And when you're talking about a folding design that folds in and out, any gap that you have is just going to be a radar signature.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, it is on the top. Typically, you're not going to see the top from the radar stations on the ground.
Yeah.
What did the Marine Corps pilots and technicians, when you talked to them, what did they of the plane? In the early testing phases, did they come to a lot of these same conclusions you did?
It was kind of mixed. I didn't really talk to the pilots so much as I really talked to the officers that were, officers and enlisted men that were in charge of maintaining the aircraft. And if you really want to know like how good an aircraft is, that's the people you really need to talk to. Is the people that are going to maintain it.
While we're on the subject of maintenance, I may have had the acronym wrong, but I think it's ALIS, Automated Logistics Information System, God. I guess. There's a big deal made about this thing being kind of one way to make the F-35 a more effective logistics platform in a sense, because they're trying to incorporate some of the advances in cloud computing and all the other stuff that in the private sector they kind of come up with for civilian use. I shouldn't say private sector, I should say civilians, because obviously there's private companies that the government works with, but the idea was you would have a very advanced inventory kind of real-time information system. That's the limit of my understanding, but do you have any comments on that aspect, because it's obviously up your alley about maintenance and things like that?
Well, Alice was basically my whole career with Lockheed, with the aviation side of things. Alice is basically what they call commercial off-the-shelf software. I call it COTS. And basically you had like SAP back at Lockheed, and you had another computer program called CMMS, which is computerized maintenance management software.
Who developed
then
that?
You had,
do you know?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of tack on different tools.
Do you know who made CMMS?
What's that?
Do you know who made the CMMS program?
I didn't make it.
No, I didn't mean you personally, but what company? Because SAP was is a German software company. They're ERP.
Yeah, SAP has been around for years.
Yep.
CMMS, I'm not sure who the prime contractor was with it, but you're talking about a bunch of different tack on different companies that are trying to integrate not just the maintenance type of system, but a supply chain type of system. Like with the whole, like if you ever watch like the newsreels with, on YouTube with Lockheed, they talk about it like, oh, this plane is getting ready to land, and it's, the computer system already knows all the parts that it's going to need. Bullshit. Like, it didn't work. Like, when you're talking about multiple different companies that are trying to integrate like their proprietary software, it just doesn't work. And one of the things was really difficult about it when I was in the program was, I was trying to test some of the software and try to say, okay, it's prescribed to do X. It's not doing that. Okay, we've already got like 3 different contracts, that are going to last for the next 7 years. Like, we need to put, some of these requirements in the contract, to get these companies to fix this sort of stuff. So, I mean, that's one of the things that's very different about the commercial world versus, let's say, the defense contractor world is things are, they're years ahead of schedule. You can't just be like Walmart and just say like, okay, or Amazon, we're going to do X and we're going to go ahead and do it. We're going to, create this program or this feature or whatever. With the defense world, no, you have to get it on contract, and you have to know exactly what you want to do. You have to have the exact requirements that you want to do. And that's what made it very, very difficult.
What is the traditional logistics chain for an aircraft maintenance program look like? Let's forget, all the press releases from Lockheed for the moment, but let's go back 30 years before the internet, before computers really caught on to the extent they are today, obviously, at least. What was the approach? Like, you just had a bunch of spare parts and you had no idea, like, you didn't know like how often they would be needed. Like, you just had like way more than you could anticipate needing, or they're trying to go to like just in time now. Like, what's the difference?
Well, there was never anything such as just in time, with the military. That's just really, that's a pure production type of environment. What you're talking about here, like with the F-35 and even the F-22, which is its precursor. With the F-22, every copy that they ever made had its own build, what you call build. And they call it provisioning or build. Every copy that you made had different parts on it. It's not like your car that you have today where you can go in an AutoZone and say like, I've got a 2012 Toyota Tacoma. I need X part. No, I mean it's unique to every aircraft.
Is that because
And
they just couldn't get the manufacturing